Hi there, my name is Mikhail Matveev and I'm here to show you how to solder my board, which is called Frank. This is emulation platform which allows you to emulate older computers and even play some games like Doom or Quake. So you can find out more about this project on my page. This video will show you how to solder the complex part of this board, which includes the QFN chips and the HDMI board and so on. So I hope this is gonna help you and have fun.
The Frank board contains a number of QFN chips which are quite difficult to solder the first time, and it will take practice to learn how to do it quickly and effectively. This type of chip differs from conventional chips like SOP in that it lacks pins. In practice, this makes self-assembly of a device with such kind of chips somewhat more difficult. However, it doesn't make the process completely impossible. For soldering, we will need a soldering iron, we will need flux, and we will need a heat gun, and of course some solder paste. I'm using a regular inexpensive flux from AMTech, which I bought on AliExpress, but in fact any lead-free flux should work. At this stage, our task is to remove the protective film from the chip, which will interfere with high-quality soldering in the future. We need to ensure that the film is completely removed. We apply a small amount of soldering flux to the chip. After removing the protective film, we will need to clean the chip with acetone, and applying too much flux will make this task more difficult in the future. Cleaning is performed with a soldering iron heated to something like 304 degrees Celsius, and make sure that you use a tip with a flat surface. Don't be afraid of damaging the chip. Thoroughly clean the contact surfaces with a soldering iron until you're sure that there are no matte surfaces left. You need to make sure that no protective film remains on any of the chip's contact pads. Otherwise, this could complicate the soldering process later on. There should be virtually no solder left on the soldering iron. Otherwise, the chip will be harder to solder. However, a small amount of solder will remain on the contact pads, which means that the protective film has been completely removed. There are small contact pads on the sides of the chip. Make sure that you treat them the same way you treated the main contact pads. You must treat each side of the chip to ensure that the protective film is completely removed. The next step is to clean the chip with acetone. This allows us to perform a visual inspection and ensure that no protective film remains. The next step is to apply solder paste on the board. I use low temperature solder paste rated for 138 degrees. This simplifies the soldering process. You need to apply a small amount of solder paste, but if you apply more, it's not a big deal. The excess solder paste will flow out from under the chip on its own during the hot air blow dry process. The next step is to carefully place the chip on the board. Make sure the markings on the board and the chip align, otherwise nothing will work. There is no need to precisely position the chip at this stage. Just lay the chip on the top of the solder paste. Next, we will need a heat gun. Any inexpensive heat gun will do. You need to set the temperature to around 400 degrees Celsius and the blower speed to minimum. Next, begin blowing air using slow circular motions. Make sure that the air flows evenly from both sides. As you blow air, you will see the chip automatically position itself on the tracks, and the solder balls will begin to emerge from the underneath the chip. You're gonna need tweezers to ensure the chip is properly positioned on the tracks. You can press the chip several times to ensure that all the solder has come out as balls. This is normal. Don't worry about overheating the chip. At this stage, you need to make sure that the solder paste has turned into solder everywhere, including on the contact pad underneath the chip. Make sure the chip is positioned precisely on the contact pads. Remember, if something goes wrong, do not worry. You can remove the chip, then you can clean the pads and repeat the process over and over as long as you need. You need to make sure the chip is soldered evenly. If you notice any unevenness on any side, you need to repeat the process. Next, you need to remove any excess solder balls. Clean each side with a soldering iron, and then clean the soldering iron with a metal sponge. Now we apply a small amount of soldering flux to the sides of the chip. It's important to apply flux on all sides. Next, we will need solder. I'm using kindness solder, but you can use any solder you like. And our goal is to apply solder to the edges of the chip on each of its 4 sides and ensure all the chip contacts are sealed tightly. Next, we need to clean the chip of flux using acetone. This is important as a clean surface will allow us to perform a more thorough visual inspection. Now, using an electronic magnifying glass, we can inspect the contact pad and make sure that all contacts and everything is soldered and the chip is positioned evenly. Thus, we soldered the chip at home and it looks quite well. To solder capacitors, resistors and other passive components, I apply solder paste at 200 degrees Celsius to the board in small even dots. I apply a small drop to each pad, trying to maintain an equal amount of solder paste on each pad. If you accidentally apply too much paste, remove the excess with a cotton swab. Next, carefully place the components on the board using tweezers. Finally, use your heat gun in order to hit all the components on your board. Make sure that you don't miss anything and make sure to hit all the components properly. To solder conventional SOP chips, it is necessary to first place a small amount of flux on the contact pads and then apply solder to each pad. Next, place the chip on the contact pads and use a heat gun to solder it. Next comes another relatively complex part of the assembly, soldering the USB connector. To ensure a high quality soldering job, you need to apply first flux to the contact pads. Carefully position the connector and, using a small amount of solder the contacts. Next, you need to apply more flux to the contacts and double check that all contacts are soldered correctly. Make sure that you do not forget to solder the pads on the back side of the board as well. Make sure there is no short circuit. Use a tester to check for crossovers between power lines. Connect the power and connect the switch contacts to ensure that the power is supplied correctly. Another difficult step is soldering the HDMI connector. My method involves applying a generous amount of flux, which helps distribute the solder evenly between the contacts and to prevent short circuits. And this is how the final result looks like.